Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you this week, whooping cough is a concern in the UK, and general practitioners or primary physicians are issuing a warning about the necessity of vaccinating children. Amazon has started to somewhat regulate the supplement industry that they're selling on their platform, a goal not even the FDA is willing to try for. Autism signs are being detected in mini brains that are grown artificially, and the anti-vaxxers are going to have to answer the question of what vaccines are they giving at these artificial mini brains. In Australia, a Magpie swooping season has arrived, and the various tricks and tools used to keep them away. Denmark will implement a carbon tax of $100 per cow, amongst other animals. The world's first industrial plant for the production of fuel using solar power. UVA and Toyota are aiming to give your car a degree of reasoning and autonomy. And we have the effect Starlink satellites, and others for that matter, could have on the healing ozone layer, and particularly the ozone hole. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Starting in the UK with whooping cough. Whooping cough is a particularly nasty disease for all the fact that the name does not sound that bad. Nonetheless, already this year, 8 babies have died due to it, which is a much higher number than it should ever be. We have a very effective vaccine that's almost universally going to work for everybody and provide complete coverage. There's no reason 8 babies should have died due to whooping cough. Now, the illness is properly called pertussis, but nonetheless, no matter what you want to call it, it shouldn't be a problem, and yet it is. And this is the problem. There is a vaccine available, the vaccine works, there is a reason to use it, and there is a group of people, in this case babies, who could be treated with it, and yet it doesn't happen, because we have idiot anti-vaxxers who think that anyone older than 4 probably shouldn't be alive. The numbers don't necessarily demonstrate the same kind of, let's say, realistic expectation you might think. Obviously, in places like Sheffield, Nottingham and Bristol, where there is a larger population, there is a commensurately larger number of cases. But nonetheless, there is a general spread of whooping cough across the UK, and this is something that just should not be happening. In far more promising news, we have a viable treatment for Parkinson's, and it's already been FDA approved. Now, this is particularly important. The difficulty will be not so much that the drug has already been approved. It's much easier now to get it applied to Parkinson's if it can be demonstrated to be effective. The problem is that, unfortunately, because it's a new application of an existing drug, this new application should, in theory, be able to be patented if it hasn't already. The other, let's say, caveat to this is that it is an anti-cancer drug, and that does mean that it's liable to have a number of effects, which will need to be overcome before this can become what is effectively a day-to-day treatment for this, which is a slight concern. On the other hand though, if, and this is a massive if, this research is, let's say, published as is, it's entirely possible that you may not be able to patent the application of it in this respect. With the possibility of a relatively freely accessible drug, one that's known to have a particular set of safety profiles to it, and everything else, you might be happy, but don't be overjoyed just yet. This is not going to stop Parkinson's disease. What it will do is it will slow it down. Now, slowing it down is arguably better than nothing. After all, this is effectively a one-way street. The slower you can travel down that street, the better you will be for longer, but you will still get to the end of it, and unfortunately the end of the line is not particularly pleasant. In other safety profile news, we have what could be described as a sort of achievement where Amazon will now start at least having some degree of regulatory oversight when it comes to dietary supplements. Now, to be clear about it, there is practically no effective oversight anywhere in the world for supplements as an industry. This is why, surprisingly and rather ironically, many supplements get withdrawn or recalled, not because they're not doing what they're supposed to do, but rather they get contaminated with an actual medication that's known to work. Yeah, you get a recall or a withdrawal of products because they actually have a working or functional drug in them. And that's the key here. Most supplements are simply so poorly regulated and there's so little oversight that they get away with putting whatever they want in there until something bad happens. This is where Amazon is doing what the FDA should be doing, but can't. And that is ensuring quality, and at best of times, ensuring that they're at least not going to cause any harm. But the FDA can't do that. They just don't have the finances and the funding to do so. So without staff and all the facilities required to test them, they just can't do anything. Not until something goes wrong anyway. Amazon, however, beyond the fact that they make an absolute fortune, does indeed have the necessary ability to do this. It is arguably very much likely that Amazon's decision isn't going to come out of nowhere. Rather, it's that the FDA has communicated to Amazon that they are concerned about the availability of adulterated supplements available on the platform. And given that Amazon both acts as a platform and their own private retailer, it's a problem because they don't know if they themselves are going to be in trouble next, or if the various, retailers that are on the platform are the ones responsible. And so they have brought in what can be best described as a standard, or at least a modicum of a standard. Supplements now need to have a verification provided through one of 3 different organizations, these being Eurofins, UL, and NS National. These labels need to appear on the packaging, and they need to submit the results of the testing from these other parties to establish that what they're providing is actually what's meant to be provided. But importantly, Amazon isn't just doing this for everything, so they're not really providing a complete cover for all supplements. They're related to weight management, sexual enhancement, and sports nutrition, which basically means so long as you claim that your product's in a different category than this, Amazon doesn't care, which is true of Amazon in general. When they make someone have to pee in a bottle because they don't have enough time to actually stop and go to the toilet when delivering packages, it's a good sign that their humanity is, well, they give the devil a run for his money. The supplements are not just in the spotlight this week due to, Amazon's efforts to try and regulate them, but because one of the major driving factors behind them is, in trouble for likely fabricating data. Yeah, now, the findings are a bit odd, let's say. The first reason is simply that the person involved was originally exonerated of any question about misconduct, but the university came back a second time and it made further inquiries, further investigation, and a further analysis of the work and found that at least some of the data has likely been fabricated regarding the quality of things like echinacea, ginkgo biloba, and other substances. All of these are fairly common nutritional supplements. And that's something of a concern. After all, any kind of misconduct should always be a red flag, particularly with regards to other misconduct that may not have been identified just yet. The reason their work is important is not just that they've now been found to be somewhat questionable, but that the article going way back to 2013 is one of the major things that threw a spotlight on supplements as a whole industry, and particularly about how reliable they were in providing what they claimed to have been providing. It is noteworthy again that although their work is certainly not to be trusted, There has been a substantial amount of subsequent work which has effectively vindicated what they found, but it's worth remembering that their actual work can't be trusted. So, although the original impetus is completely wrong, everything that followed afterwards seems to have supported that, which it doesn't justify the means, but the end result is certainly correct. More so when that initial work effectively forced larger companies into testing their products and ensuring quality control. It does get rather more embarrassing for the good doctor himself as well, when at least two of his accusers regarding some of this work are co-authors on the paper in question that gave rise to this, along with one of his own students that he was supervising. This is more or less having your own team call you out for cheating in a video game, or even just in a sports ball in general. And as such, it's not going to go well, especially since the subsequent and second investigation, which was prompted by the Canadian government's research integrity watchdog, telling the university that where he's at that the original investigation wasn't up to standard. The second investigation involved outside individuals who are experts in the field, and they've concluded that yes, the academic did indeed engage in a variety of, behaviors that simply aren't acceptable. Next we have what is arguably more personal again, rather than just the ramifications of bad medication. It's the ramification of, arguably, a bad surgery. It's the effect that losing both ovaries could have on the brain. Now, losing both ovaries can come as a variety of consequences, whether it is something like ectopic pregnancy, which rather obviously, given that it's in the fallopian tube and the only way to remove the tube is to remove the ovary too. Or it can be a result of a hysterectomy in which all of the reproductive system is removed, and so on. There are a variety of ways in which this can happen. And there's the question, what actually happens afterwards? The study looked at data from more than 1,000 females, but they were all over age 50, so this does have a slight problem that we'll get into shortly. The other thing is that all of the individuals that were involved, as far as the data goes, had the ovaries removed before the age of 40. They did try and compare them to a control group of about 900 females under the age of 50 who were roughly matched as far as age and other circumstances go. The study claims to have found a reduction in white matter, but the younger this happened, the less pronounced that change was. That's a worrying feature, but it is important to be aware of the fact that in general, removing of ovaries has a wide range of effects on the female body. Not all of them are just limited to the brain. For instance, bone density can be affected. You can have higher risk of various cardiovascular diseases, and there are a range of other possibilities. So, a brain-related development like this isn't by itself particularly noteworthy. Well, we should phrase that slightly differently. It's noteworthy in that it does identify an effect, but that the effect is not something unexpected. This is relevant even if we're talking about the issues to do with removing the ovaries prior to, during, or after menopause. That's just one possibility of reducing the functionality of the ovaries, as they still, to a certain extent, will continue to produce the hormones in the female body. So it's not as though this is just once you hit menopause, you don't need to worry anymore. Actually, it's quite the opposite. There's a shift in your risk profile as you age, and particularly in cardiovascular disease, for instance. The shifting in the female body function and the various roles that hormones play becomes more important because most medication and treatment is based solely on the idea that you are the same your entire life, which just isn't the case. Going now to the neurological on a artificial scale. It's signs of autism in artificially grown mini brains. Now, the generally understood, and let's be clear about this is the broad perspective, is that autism is a neurological disorder based on a combination of genetics, the genetics playing out in how the brain develops, and then the effect of brain development on behaviors. So you have a cascading series of events. Now through support, education, counseling, medication, and so on, some of those neurological changes can be overcome or at least compensated for, leading to the individual leading a complete and fulfilling life and basically having largely little difference to anybody else. But how you go from genetics to the diagnoses is somewhat more challenging. This example might, and let's be clear about it, there's a lot of questions here that need to be clarified, that might tell us something about the neuropathologies. That's because you have what can be kindly described as a two-part split in autism: high functioning and low functioning. A high functioning are those individuals who, for the most part, you wouldn't really be able to differentiate except for the fact they spend all their time on 4chan and use Arch Linux. By contrast, you have low functioning. This is the group who, unfortunately, are stereotyped as sitting in the corner, rocking and screaming. They're not able to communicate, and they're relatively dependent on others to care for them. The work used the blood of toddlers with autism and toddlers without autism, and they grew the brain organoids from these. It's a relatively straightforward and well-established process in terms of the ability to convert them into stem cells and then get the stem cells to grow. We've been through this in another video if you're so inclined to see. The organoids developed from this were meant to be brains, and since you can't develop a full and complete brain, at least not without, let's say, problems relating to ethics, they obviously grew only a miniature version thereof. What's interesting is that the children with autism, the organoids grew about 40% larger compared to the otherwise normal children. But not only did they grow larger, but faster. This is not unexpected in some ways. Researchers indicated that one of the possible mechanisms underlying autism is that the neurons will grow exponentially, almost anyway, in the early days of the child developing. And what's supposed to happen is neuron pruning, that is, removing the excess neurons that aren't required. But in autism, this doesn't happen. This appears to match with what's happening in these mini brains, and it's also consistent to the degree of excess growth, let's say, with the severity of autism that was exhibited by the toddler. This is not to say that it's necessarily going to be any help initially, since most of what's being observed is in embryonic development, but it is possible that it could play a role in the future, particularly if we understand the interplay of genetics and the brain development, since we now have some idea about which parts of the brain, let's say, grow more aggressively or more quickly in that embryonic period, therefore having an effect on children later in life and eventually into adulthood. Shifting to animal news now, and the environment. Australia's bird swooping season has begun, with the Magpie deciding that it's not only horny, but territorial. Not quite that, but nonetheless, the joke is still to be made, because that is pretty much what birds are doing the entire time they're making noise. They're either saying that they want to be sexed, or they're saying, "Go away, this is my tree." As the article points out, there is more than 2,500 reports of the magpie swooping by one council in Australia. The problem with this is that, well, they're magpies. They are big enough and fast enough to be painful if they happen to catch you, but because most people try and avoid being hit in the first place, it tends to lead to accidents of children and even adults for that matter falling off their bike or just falling over when they're trying to run from the bird. When it comes to the magpies themselves, the area in which they will cause trouble, let's say, is anywhere up to 100 meters or about 300 feet from their nest, which means there's a pretty big area where they will attack people. Although according to the reports, only 10% or so of magpies will actually attack people. But this is matched with two things. One, this is Australia, where everything seems to want to either attack you, kill you, or otherwise end you as an existence. And second, the actual number of reports continues to go down year on year, but the number of magpies being aggressive doesn't as far as the research shows. This would indicate that people just aren't reporting the number of aggressive magpies. Therefore, the problem is not necessarily that 10% of magpies will swoop, it's that only 10% of attacks, if not less, actually get reported. Shifting to other animal news now, we have a, not necessarily solution, but a attempt at solving the problem of rhino horns being attractive to poachers, but often quite desirable, generally speaking, as a solution to a poor bedtime performance. The solution? Make them radioactive. While radiation may allow Hulk to smash, it won't allow let's say a particularly flaccid individual to smash, and this is because radiation isn't good for you, assuming you weren't aware of this already. This will then raise the question of, well, why do it then? What's the point if the horn's no use? And it's not that they're trying to prevent it being used at the end, the consumer, so to say. Rather, radiation will make it infinitely easier to be able to detect these horns as it goes through the various borders across the world. Most international borders, especially when you have ports for shipping, airports for aircraft, and so on and so forth, tend to have at least some modicum of radiation detection systems in place, and this is simply to avoid people bringing in, say, nuclear weapons, or similar issues. And so, if they can detect the radiation from the horn, they know that whoever's bringing this in is bringing in something that they shouldn't be. This solution is not being used mildly, let's say. Not only is the decision fairly substantial, if only because it's a large investment in time, effort, and resources, but also because, well, they kind of need to do something. The number of rhinos being poached, and particularly in government-run parks and similar, is going up year on year. The good news to this is that, well, the amount of radiation and the way they're administering it basically means that the rhinos won't even know it's there, and it won't harm them or the environment around them. And to other expensive animal-related news, Denmark is bringing in a tax on cows. Now, a tax on cows is by no means a novel idea. For example, they're already taxed as both a asset and as a product. For instance, let's say you're trying to use them in a milk or dairy farm. You're going to have them producing a product, but that's it, so they become taxed as an asset, at least as long as they're producing. In other terms, if you're selling them as a meat cow, let's say, they would obviously be a product because you sell them to the abattoir, and then the abattoir sees fit to disposing of them before they send the remains off to the butcher. The reason this tax is a dumb idea is not just limited to the fact that, well, it's an expense for farmers who are already in an absolute fury over what they're doing with regards to other parts of the agricultural sector, but it's because it's not just limited to cows. It applies to any kind of CO2 or a greenhouse gas emitting animal. This includes pigs, sheep, cows, and more. And guess what Denmark is a massive producer of? Dairy and pork. Two of the animal product areas that will be hit massively. It gets arguably even worse again for the dairy industry, to start with anyway, as the $100 that will be spent now per cow is the initial starting point. Between 2030, when this comes into effect, and 2035, there will be a gradual increase in the tax rate, going up to $240 per cow. We go now to another European country where in Italy, rather than the government and bureaucrats causing problems at Vandals, the Vandals have destroyed a GMO rice field that was trialing a rather obviously genetically modified kind of rice. What they were looking at was how to deal with fungal diseases and therefore improve yield and make rice growing more sustainable. But now they're going to have to start all over again, which is a problem. This is not something easily done. Not just is it not easily done, but you now have to account for the fact there's going to be a huge expense of growing up all of these starter seeds again. They're going to have to get all of that labor redone. They're going to have to hopefully get all the approvals done again, and there are all sorts of other issues. So this is not just a simple matter of, oh, you just need to plant it again. No, this act of vandalism, unlike other examples, is going to cost a lot more than just what comes to mind initially. In other sustainability news, we have the first of kind, or at least first in form, industrial plant that is going to make fuel using solar power. Now, the simple idea isn't that novel, let's say. After all, the idea of taking solar power and using it to produce other things is, well, honestly not that new. For a simple example, sunlight has been used in greenhouses, and this has allowed for a very large-scale production of all kinds of things. But using it to produce the energy that's then put into producing new fuels, that's a slightly different story. The idea is taking several disparate and discrete and separate things and bringing them all together. The first is that it is basically a giant solar receiver. Think of it as being a series of mirrors all concentrating a large amount of light into a solar tower, and this tower itself, which is about 20 meters high, will take all of that heat, and that heat will be used to produce fuel. Now, the plant is supposed to produce several thousand liters of fuel each year, and we're waiting to see how accurate that number is going to be. Importantly though, it's only going to produce synthetic crude oil. Now, this will then need to be distilled and refined to produce actual usable fuel, but the ability to completely synthesize it is a massive step forward, as that's going to be taking what is otherwise fossil fuels, something that we only have a finite amount of, and allow us to make it from scratch. It also has the second advantage, let's say. The second advantage is that it allows for the crude oil that it's producing to be refined in current, existing, and basically conventional refineries. That means that the current setup and industry around fossil fuels, other than the obvious mining for it or drilling for oil and similar, will be able to be sustained and certainly extend its lifetime by a significant margin. That's because they can produce aviation fuel, they can produce petroleum, that is your standard vehicle petrol, and they can produce diesel fuel, all of which are currently used in many vehicles. In other vehicle-related news, we have the collaboration between Toyota and the University of Virginia to give your car the ability to think and reason, which does sound rather terrifying, or perhaps brings back memories of Knight Rider. The whole purpose behind this is simple. Self-driving cars, or autonomous cars, are going to be the future. There's really no two ways about it. As a result, you need to be worried about what this massive chunk of metal and various plastics, along with a squishy human inside, are going to do. The current examples aren't entirely encouraging, but nonetheless, they're not intended to be entirely autonomous. But what if they were? Well, based on current examples, we're going to have a lot more road accidents. and so giving them the ability to reason should, and we say should with a huge caveat to it, help considerably with this. The plan at the moment could be best described as teaching cars how to drive. It's intended to be able to teach them through machine learning why drivers do what they do and the meaning of the actions, thereby allowing the car, let's say, to better act on the road and better explain its actions. How and why this is different is simply that most of the current attempts basically rely on getting huge data sets and trying to make the machine be able to predict and apply every single possible scenario. This approach is somewhat different. Rather than try and take every scenario and have the machine recognize them, they instead want to take a series of set skills and knowledge and be able to apply them to any different scenario and therefore react accordingly, which is basically what a learning driver is meant to do. Meant to do, but rarely successfully achieves, mind you. And that's the other catch to this. The other fundamental goal is that by having this machine learning algorithm, this quasi-AI, if you will, assist in driving, a learner driver, for instance, can have the vehicle adjusted to what needs to happen, even if they're not aware of it, which does, to a certain extent, take away some of the autonomy and certainly necessary skills that a driver would need. In other news related to AI, we have claims that an AI has developed what could be considered a magnet, but a magnet that doesn't require rare earth metals, which are often used in the production of magnets. For example, neodymium magnets are the small, very powerful magnets that you would often see used in many applications. For example, if you have a small workshop, your tools may be fixed to metal surfaces using them. In other instances, they're often used in a lot of, let's describe them as hack videos. Most of them are actually a hack, but a different meaning to the word. The idea here is that as we move further and further towards a world in which electricity rather than fossil fuels are the go-to option, but this could well be a necessity since a lot of the electric vehicles, and for that matter a lot of other technology, uses rare earth magnets, and there's just not enough rare earth available to be practical. And most of that is not only sourced from a few countries, but processed and even fewer again, which isn't good if anything should ever go awry with West Taiwan. Of course, making a rare earth magnet without rare earth is not new. It's certainly not the first of kind by any stretch of the imagination. But what is important here is that where doing this as a human, for instance, would require decades possibly of trial and error, the company in question didn't need anywhere near that. In fact, Materials Nexus, the company that owns the AI platform that made this, only needed 3 months to go from designing it to having tested it. And that is a massive achievement. The way it works is simply by analyzing millions and millions of possible rare earth free magnets and trying to figure out what can fit together how and why. And then comparing this to the availability of various materials that could be used. And from this, you basically get a list of possibilities. From this list of possibilities, you can then start assembling, or let's say producing, various prototypes until eventually you have something that works. The advantages beyond the diplomatic and political comes down to money. Now, your rare earth magnet is typically quite expensive, and not just because you have to dig it out of the ground, process it, refine it, and then ship it around the world, but because, well, they often have a pretty big, let's say, environmental impact, not just at the mining site, but at the refining location as well. The first thing here is that these magnets, based on not using rare earth magnets, are 20% of what the cost would be to produce them using rare earth. The second is that they're only about 30% of the carbon cost, or that is the amount of carbon that's emitted in making them. Next we go to other technology-related news, but it's technology news talking about what happens when, well, things eventually begin to become obsolete. And it's NASA being sued after a piece of space debris fell to Earth and hit their home. The Florida family is claiming that their home was hit by a small piece of debris, and by small we're talking a piece of debris about the size of your fist, and, well, smashed through their roof. Although they only want $80,000, which is not all that much considering. The space debris is supposed to be part of a pallet of what was sent up to the ISS. Now it's called a stanchion, and the stanchion's basically a cylinder about the height of your fist, and the amount that eventually survived re-entry is almost the same size, just far more deformed, and it weighs about 700 grams. And although while no one was actually hurt, the family is suing not just for the damage itself, but they're also suing for what they describe as adequate compensation for stress and impact. Yeah, this could be an interesting lawsuit, as it is likely to set a precedent for future lawsuits, not just against NASA, but against any space administration. So for example, Japan, Europe, China and India, or even Russia if they ever get off the ground again. And so, it's interesting to see if and or where this will go over the next 6 months, which is roughly the time frame that NASA has to respond. The final news item we have for you this week is the combination of not only space news, but to a certain extent environmental news. It's the impact that satellites may have on the ozone layer, and particularly the hole on the ozone layer, or in the ozone layer, due to satellites. The sheer number of satellites around Earth is just getting more and more every year, and it's not just in terms of the number of satellites that are being deployed for new purposes, but even older, defunct satellites that are currently sitting on hiatus while companies figure out what to do with them, that is adding to this figure. And of course, some companies like Starlink are just launching them like crazy. Some of these are, well, let's say ambitious goals. Others are just from people being lazy and not wanting to destroy something that they put a lot of money into, and others again are actually useful. So what is this massive satellite going to do? According to one study at least, that the aluminium oxide particles that are being emitted from all these satellites could be creating a problem, and it could be harming the ozone layer, which is not necessarily inaccurate. We say not necessarily, as things aren't so simple. Yes, it is true that the aluminium oxide could cause a reaction, and let's be clear about this. It's not unreasonable to say that that is a possibility. What is important to note is that the ozone layer isn't necessarily as vulnerable to this reaction as you might think at first. The reason why it's not necessarily as vulnerable to the aluminium oxide as you might think is how we get the ozone layer to start with. It's basically generated by the ultraviolet light from the sun hitting our atmosphere and then reacting. This reaction causes free radicals, that is, oxygen-based molecules, to be produced. Now, some of these are named rather creatively, and some of them are not. Some of them are literally called NOx. But all of them are produced roughly the same way. When you get something like aluminium oxide reacting with them, you can, at least in theory. This may lead to a short-lived product. The other possibility is that as you increase the amount of metals in the atmosphere, and particularly aluminium, you'll find that it has a cooling effect, and this in turn can cause an increase in various products to be generated. Now, there's a lot of technical details to it, but in short, this is good and bad. The good side to it is, well, global warming could be somewhat countered by, well, in this case, global cooling of a kind. But on the other hand, you are beginning to screw with what can be kindly described as Earth's normal processes. And this is the problem. The reason it works the way it does, other than the fact that the aluminium oxide can react, is that it provides a better environment for those reactions to occur. Not only does the aluminium oxide act as a sort of, let's say, a platform, or a solid environment for the reactions to happen, because it is a solid metal, it allows for various reactions to occur, and it keeps them there for now. That means that you alter, to a certain extent, the nature of the atmosphere, at least temporarily, and the researchers claim that the rate at which this effect will occur will only go up over time. But even with our limited knowledge of what might happen based on models derived from volcanic eruptions, it's still something of a mystery. We don't really know, and it's really hard to predict since we don't know exactly what the contamination is, nor how much or how quickly it will change. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, do consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below as well.